So just a reminder for any of those who haven't joined one of our webinars before, Andy and I founded this British Isles Latter-day Saint Association as independent of any church, and it seeks to involve anyone and everyone from enthusiast to academic scholar, anyone who's got an interest in the church history in the British Isles. And we welcome different perspectives, but we also ask that if we do have those different perspectives, that you do it with kindness and courtesy all the way through. Now, our presenter today, Matthew Rasmussen. We've asked, who is this man? This interesting fella. That's what gives him the understanding and the grounding to talk about this 20th century British membership. Now, we originally met when Matthew was studying here. He's from Utah, but he was living here while he was a missionary for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But then he returned to come do his PhD at Lancaster University. That's when he was based at Kendal, the branch of Kendal. And while he was here, part of his studies produced something. Now, he hasn't asked me to show you his book. This isn't like a commission-based. Is it commission-based? I don't think it is.
No comment.
Call it, yeah. This is the thing that resulted from his Lancaster University days when he wandered the streets and vales of the Ribble Valley. It's called Mormonism and the Making of a British Zion. And it's quite a fun little thing. I really like the way he's written it. And in fact, just to give you, again, a bit of unsolicited advertising here, I just like on the back, it says, the finest comprehensive study of the LDS Church in an international setting that I've ever read. That's from an author called Richard Bennett, which I think is beautifully written. So if you want to learn more about Matthew's kind of thoughts, then available from fine bookstores. Now, once Matthew left us, returned to Utah, and he now teaches in the church seminaries and institutes, which is his current occupation. He's a religious education teacher in the church's student services in Salt Lake. Matthew's going to speak for about 30 minutes. And at the end of that, we will then have another half an hour for questions and answers and just a discussion about anything that he's raised. So what you can do as we're going through, if a question comes to you, just write it in the chat and during his talk, and we can then look at those during the discussion. So Matthew, welcome back to England, and may we turn the time over to you now.
Peter and Andrew, thank you both very much. This is such a treat. And I know that historians pride themselves on their dispassionate objectivity, that they can render something of sound academic quality. I don't know that I'm capable of that, in the sense that my time in the English Northwest has meant everything to me. What it has led to in terms of education and personal experience and relationships is just so rich. So my motive for digging deeper and deeper into Latter-day Saint history in the English Northwest, it's a personal motivation, and it's rendering all kinds of fruitful things in my life. And thank you, Peter. I'll hope to see a slight uptick in book sales owing to your endorsement, and the royalties might be enough to take my wife on a date. We'll see. Well, I would also just like to point out that I'm coming at you today from Heber City, Utah, which you would know from your own familiarity with Latter-day Saint history that the namesake of my town is Heber C. Kimball, whom we regard as the father of British Mormonism. And his grave is a stone's throw from my office in downtown Salt Lake City. So periodically, Heber and I get together and we have a little talk. So I hope that he would approve of some of the things that I intend to share with you now. The title of my presentation will be familiar to those of you who are acquainted with Latter-day Saint hymns. It may not be on the mountain height are the opening words of a hymn number 270, titled, I'll Go Where You Want Me to Go. The full verse reads as follows. It may not be on the mountain height or over the stormy sea. It may not be at the battle's front, my Lord will have need of me. But if by a still small voice he calls to paths that I do not know, I'll answer, dear Lord, with my hand in thine. I'll go where you want me to go. Now, these lyrics were penned in 1899 by a Baptist woman named Mary Brown. Although not a Latter-day Saint, Mary's lyrics have an uncanny relevance to an important transition that was then playing out in the Transatlantic Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm talking specifically of the decades-old immigration program and the efforts of church leaders to bring it to a close at the dawn of the 20th century. For 60 years, British Latter-day Saints expected to go over that stormy sea, past the battlefront of Mormonism's many opponents, and up to the mountain height, to Zion itself, where the society of saints awaited them. But things were about to change. If 19th century British Latter-day Saints are remembered for any one thing, it is probably their immigration, their willingness to hearken to the call of a prophet they had never met, leave their home shores, and gather to one of the least hospitable regions of North America to build Zion. The tens of thousands of British converts who did this altered forever the development of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, to say nothing of the impact their emigration had on their personal lives, fortunes, and families. Emigration was the urgent application of a uniquely Latter-day Saint doctrine, the doctrine of gathering. The gathering was first preached in Britain in 1840 and was encouraged and celebrated throughout the remainder of the 19th century. But by the time Joseph F. Smith was ordained to the presidency of the church in 1901, the place of emigration had become uncertain. By 1911, it was overtly at odds with the global expansion that would characterize the church in the 20th century. Although there's no question that the prophet Joseph Smith anticipated the globalization of the restored Church of Jesus Christ, it was Joseph F. Smith, his nephew and eventual successor, who dealt fully with the complexities of an international church. These complexities included an important challenge: reorienting the westward expectations of British church members and ending transatlantic emigration, thereby closing one of the most storied chapters of Latter-day Saint history. My purpose this evening is to explore this important transition with you and shed light on what I believe is a true tipping point in the history of British Mormonism. The moment in which the great gathering in of the converts of the 19th century was supplanted by an equally great reaching out of church members and missionaries in the 20th century. Put simply, when, in their commitment to building up Zion, did British Latter-day Saints stop looking westward and start looking homeward, and why? Latter-day Saint emigration cannot be studied independent of Latter-day Saint belief. In his 1842 summary of the restored gospel, Joseph Smith explained that Latter-day Saints believe in a God who reveals truth to prophets. Truth, as defined in an 1833 revelation, is knowledge of things as they are, as they were, and as they are to come. For Latter-day Saints, truth concerns itself simultaneously with past, present, and future realities. It embraces and responds to changing human circumstances. The Latter-day Saints' ninth article of faith affirmed belief in all that God has revealed, all that he does now reveal, and that he will yet reveal, many great and important things pertaining to his kingdom. Thus, from the earliest years of the restoration, revelation and adaptation, or openness to inspired change, were established as vital and fully compatible principles. The gathering was revealed doctrine, but more than this, it was also a marvelously energizing, creative, and motivating religious impulse. For British Latter-day Saints, It was the invitation of a lifetime. Emigration drew urgency from the early saints' eschatology. They believed Christ's return was imminent. They saw themselves as his covenant people. They were determined to prepare to receive him and assist in his millennial reign. That's quite a mission statement. The anticipation of this reunion also fueled the development of a temple theology, to which the gathering was linked. The object of the gathering, the prophet Joseph taught, was, quote, to build unto the Lord a house, whereby he could reveal unto his people the ordinances and the glories of his kingdom, and teach the people the way of salvation, close quote. The saints' millenarian outlook spurred the construction of multiple temples, where from Kirtland to Nauvoo to Salt Lake City, and eventually to Chorley, God's presence was both symbolized and realized. The gathering as doctrine was straightforward enough, but the gathering as practice plunged the British Latter-day Saints into a fascinating and complicated matrix of economic, religious, social, and familial factors, from which emerged hundreds of Latter-day Saint settlements throughout America's Intermountain West. Beginning in 1840, the gathering doctrine was gradually systematized. In short order, it had become central to British saints' hopes and dreams. It was a defining doctrine, an integral part of Latter-day Saint identity. Accordingly, the reinterpretation of the gathering doctrine toward the century's end bore profound consequences for believers. The gathering doctrine was transmitted through the Latter-day Saints' Millennial Star, the Lancashire-based periodical through which the call to Zion pulsed to all of Britain. Between 1840 and 1918, the Millennial Star featured hundreds of bulletins and articles pertaining to the gathering. These articles can be grouped into two general categories: practical and doctrinal. The practical articles dealt with the various logistical issues associated with emigration, of which there were many. The doctrinal articles connected the gathering to the revealed will of God, the prophecies of the last days, and the blessings that awaited the faithful in Zion. Proportionately, the practical articles outnumbered the doctrinal articles by a ratio of 4-to-1. It was the gathering's celebrated fruits and not its revealed roots which captivated editor and reader alike. Over time, the Millennial Star editors discovered that neglecting the gathering's doctrinal foundation could affect adversely emigration rates. In 1855, for example, year-end statistical reports reveal that 388 total converts emigrated from the combined Preston, Liverpool, and Manchester conferences. In that same year, the editors of the Millennial Star printed 20 articles concerning emigration, of which only one dealt with the gathering from a doctrinal perspective. Neglecting the doctrine, emigration began to wane. The interplay between doctrine and practice is again manifest in 1870 and 1876, 2 years in which relatively few members emigrated. During both years, Millennial Star editors accented the doctrinal underpinnings of the gathering. The number of doctrinal articles exceeded the practical reports more than 2-to-1. Emphasizing the doctrine, emigration increased. The number of converts emigrating from the English Northwest tripled from 40 in 1876 to 121 in 1878. While additional factors unaccounted for here no doubt contribute to this increase, it is likely that the authoritative teachings purveyed through the Millennial Star month after month played a significant, if not dominant, role. In all, over 500 articles regarding the gathering were printed in the Millennial Star between the year the prophet Joseph opened immigration to Nauvoo and the year Joseph F. Smith assumed the presidency of the church. The majority of these articles, over 400, dealt with emigration as the practical implementation of the gathering doctrine. 60 years of timely doctrinal exposition, accompanied by compelling accounts of the journey and celebratory reports from emigrants upon their arrival in Zion, ingrained in the British membership a distinctly westward orientation, the reordering of which would require a revelation all its own. Just as the Millennial Star was essential to promoting immigration, it was equally influential in bringing it to an end. Interestingly, this pivotal change was not signaled in a one-time published announcement, but by a protracted, if not perplexing, silence. The following figures reveal an important contrast. Between 1880 and 1891, there were, on average, 10 articles about the gathering printed annually in the Millennial Star, and each encouraged emigration with customary zeal. Then, abruptly, all discussion of emigration ceased, with not a single article concerning the gathering published in 1892. What confusion must the British saints have felt? 14 months later, in February 1893, the silence finally broke with the authoritative words of the First Presidency, Wilford Woodruff, George Q. Cannon, and Joseph F. Smith. In a message dispatched from church headquarters, the First Presidency directed that all British and European immigration be temporarily but comprehensively suspended. Technically, the moratorium applied only to the emigration season at hand. But for readers of the Millennial Star, accustomed as they were to seeing the gathering encouraged in nearly every printed issue, it was clear that changes were afoot. This was, after all, the first time church leadership had closed the gates to Zion since the Utah War in 1858. The abeyance of emigration was temporary, but the diminishing attention given to it by the Millennial Star was not. This is the beginning of the tipping point. In fact, throughout the decade, which immediately preceded Joseph F. Smith's ordination to the presidency, only 7 articles concerning the gathering were printed. That's the fewest in any 10-year span since the periodical first went to press in 1840. Throughout the remainder of the 1890s and well into the first decade of the new century, perceptive readers of the Millennial Star observed contrasting points of view concerning the fate of the emigration program. Invoking the parlance of modern church administration, published discussion of the gathering was anything but correlated. For example, in 1896, the local leadership of the British mission discouraged emigration on the grounds that it would lead to the spiritual weakening, if not outright apostasy, of the British saints, particularly among those who supposed that covenant life would be more easily lived in Salt Lake City. Conversely, 2 years later, President George Q. Cannon composed an article published in the Star, which extolled openly the advantages of the gathering, maintaining that it was, quote, impossible for the human mind, unaided by the spirit of revelation, to comprehend the greatness of the future and the grandeur of the destiny of the people to whom this land, Utah, has been given as an abiding place, close quote. By the end of the 19th century, British emigration hinged less on the doctrine and more on the attitude, preparation, and intent of the prospective immigrant. Indeed, proper motive was the final checkpoint through which prospective immigrants had to pass. The longing to unite with already emigrated family and the desire to escape the reproach and persecution that attended their unpopular faith remained valid and approved justifications for departure. However, for individuals whose reasons for emigrating included anything other than the building up of the kingdom of God and supporting the church rather than being supported by it, the gates of Zion remained closed. Remarkably, the gathering doctrine survived this transitional season as its interpretation broadened, both theologically and geographically. Theologically, the saints maintained their belief that scattered Israel would be gathered and Zion would continue to be established, preparatory to Christ's return. But the geography of Zion was expanding, and with it changed the trajectory of the gathering. In the new century, the gathering no longer funneled converts to a single geographical destination, nor were Zion's boundaries restricted to the tops of the mountains of the newly organized state of Utah. By 1904, the adjusted interpretation of the gathering doctrine was nearly complete. Under the direction of Apostle Heber J. Grant, who then presided over the British mission, the editors of the Millennial Star proclaimed that, quote, emigration is not preached by the elders of the Latter-day Saints, and new converts who desired to connect themselves with the body of the church in Utah were positively counseled not to emigrate, close quote. Where emigration did occur, it was to be preceded by discussion with and authorization from local priesthood leadership. Wrote one editor, no saint should think of emigrating without consulting the president of the branch in which he has membership, and he will be invariably safe if he takes the advice of these men. Further seeking to discourage emigration in the new century, church leaders tried an additional approach, reputation management. They tackled enduring myths about the blessedness and ease of life in Salt Lake City, which had become embellished and idealized to near mythological proportions. In 1904, the Millennial Star reported matter-of-factly that of the 75,000 people then resident in Salt Lake City, fully one half were not members of the church. The editors then asserted a painful irony. The nearer a Latter-day Saint was to Salt Lake City, they claimed, the more difficult it would be for him or her to remain faithful. It was in Salt Lake City, they insisted, and not in polluted Manchester or crowded Liverpool, where, quote, the temptations of Satan and his efforts to destroy the faith of the saints reach their climax, almost under the shadows of the temple, close quote. In the 20th century, the Babylon-like ills of the old world had permeated the protective position of the saints in the West, and even Zion's capital city was no exception. The implication was clear: stay where you are. Zion's borders in the 20th century were now broad enough to embrace the British Latter-day Saints in their own homeland. The traditional understanding of Zion as a singular geographic location had been eclipsed by a more abstract understanding of Zion as an inward spiritual condition, what Joseph Smith had defined in 1833 as the pure in heart. Thus, Zion was wherever the saints were. From literal geography to personal spirituality, the principle of Zion remained attached to the temple, which even in Salt Lake City remained Zion's only unfailing refuge. Despite these efforts to stanch emigration, appetite for it persisted. Mixed messages from the Millennial Star contributed to this tension. Oddly, even though general policy now discouraged emigration, editors continued to publish membership correspondence which celebrated the advantages of life in Utah. Upon his arrival at Utah in 1909, John Kumard, a convert from Liverpool, wrote these words: I have been in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints a little over a year and a half. And at the end of that time, I say, as I have often said, thank God I am a Mormon. I shall never forget the first 24 hours I spent in Zion. One brother brought us over a sack of flour and 2 dozen eggs, as he thought we might need some assistance. He would not allow us to even thank him for them, said it is the duty of the saints to help one another. This is the spirit that pervades Zion. I repeat that I am thankful to the Lord that I am in this land where we can rear our children in the ways of righteousness, where they will not see drunken men rolling in the streets, nor listen to foul language, nor live in crowded cities. We have not been in Utah a year, and yet our home is nicely furnished, and we enjoy many other blessings, among them good health. I know that Mormonism is true. Well, how's that for a sales pitch? Clearly, conversion had its temporal rewards, and yet how strikingly at odds is Kumar's glowing description of life in Utah with the caution rendered 5 years earlier by the presidency of the British mission, who warned that British saints still hoping to emigrate were clinging to a dangerous naivete. Those yearning to emigrate, the mission presidency asserted, quote, do not realize the hardships of a new country. And in spite of the testimonies of those who know and have the welfare of the saints at heart, they refuse to believe that the emissaries of evil, that vice and crime, Sabbath breaking, envy, and a host of other sins are to be found in Salt Lake just as much as anywhere else on the face of the earth. Close quote. Let's bring this saga to a close. Between 1907 and 1911, the final few issues of the Millennial Star that dealt with immigration did so defensively and in response to lurid and sensationalized accusations that missionaries were recruiting young British women to go to Utah to be forced into polygamous marriages. President Joseph F. Smith personally sought to quell the controversy. He denied the allegations and invited the British popular press to correct its erroneously scandal-clad portrayal of Mormonism. In its place, he urged the media to see the Latter-day Saints as they saw themselves, members of the literally restored Church of Jesus Christ, commissioned to extend the blessings of salvation and exaltation to all nations. Public relations, not emigration, was the work of the church in the 20th century. The Millennial Star's coverage of the gathering ceased in 1911, when the editors stopped disclosing emigration figures in their year-end statistical reports. To be sure, some individuals still felt the tug to gather, but as far as the institutional church was concerned, the age of emigration was over. In a post-emigration church, the gathering retained significant yet altered doctrinal status. In 1918, shortly before Joseph F. Smith's passing, President Charles Penrose declared that the gathering in of Israel's tribes was preordained and ultimately would occur as anciently prophesied and as a sign that Christ's second coming was at hand. Interestingly, nowhere in his treatise did Penrose associate the gathering doctrine with the emigration of converts. They had ceased to be synonymous. In one sense, this brought the entire matter full circle. Rhetorically, the gathering retained its close association with the saints' enduring millenarian outlook, although now the doctrine carried no literal migratory implications for church members. The fulfillment of the prophesied gathering, it seemed, had passed from the hands of the first presidency back to God, who would, as Penrose put it, accomplish the gathering himself when the right time comes. In conclusion, the adaptation of the gathering doctrine in the early 20th century was not accomplished through a one-time prophetic pronouncement, but rather through a gradual reordering and of reasoning and rhetoric, priorities and practices. This transition spanned at least the years of Joseph F. Smith's presidency. Historians agree that the gathering of British converts in the 19th century was vital to the salvation of the American church. Their immigration offset apostasy and infused the fledgling church with new talent and testimony, creating a critical mass of believers and generations of descendants who continue to strengthen the church to this day. The reorientation of the gathering in the early 20th century was similarly essential to the survival of the British Church and prepared the way for its maturation. Wards, stakes, chapels, temples, and homegrown leadership. This transition was difficult. For some, it was confusing, and it certainly took a long time. But out of it came the future of the British Church, which we plainly see is here to stay. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, thank you. Right, everybody. We get a chance now to, I wasn't going to say interrogate Matthew, but we can, we get a chance to ask him any questions you may have. So if you do so, just write them in the chat. I will monitor those and direct them to Matthew as we go along. First off, a technical question. Somebody had asked, will we be able to get a recording of this? Our intention is that each of these webinars that we we'll put on, we'll send links out. So the previous two that Andrew and I did first, and Peter Gaffney last time, are available on YouTube for you to view them. The question was, I've got somebody who can't be here tonight who wants to watch it, and so they should be able to do so with that. Mike and Jan have a question for you. It says, do we have all those articles from the Millennial Star? I would love to read them all.
Yes, let's talk a bit about that. This is the #1 challenge that historians of the British Church face. The paper trail of British Church history is so enormous that you can spend your lifetime wading through its contents. I know, because that's what I'm still doing, right? The Millennial Star has this enormous print run. It starts in 1840 and it goes all the way through 1970, at which point church periodicals were consolidated. That's a huge print run. And all of these issues of the Millennial Star, which were sometimes printed weekly, sometimes bi-monthly, sometimes monthly, the frequency will vary, but the print run is consistent throughout. And all of these issues are available online through the Brigham Young University Library. They've all been scanned and they can be accessed. Now, when you have that much material to deal with, you need an angle of entry. And probably the most important historical source that I found that helped me navigate the bulk of Millennial Star articles is an index that was put together in 1918 by a Salt Lake City librarian, a public librarian, who saw this growing mass of literature, the Millennial Star, and she took it upon herself to index the entire thing. Now, again, this is 1840 to 1918. This index to the Millennial Star was invaluable to me. Sadly, the index was not mass produced, and it exists only in the special collections at the University of Utah. So if you want to, start making some noise, send some mildly threatening emails to the University of Utah Library and ask them to digitize Beth Euler, O-Y-L-E-R, Beth Euler's index to the Millennial Star, 1840 to 1918. That index, I can't put a price tag on that. Next to Roger's house in Kendall, I hope that somebody leaves that to me in your will.
Thank you.
Good question.
A question from Justice Manning. He says, has the termination of emigration affected overall membership of the church in England?
Yeah, let's back up on that a little bit. You may be familiar with the religious census of 1852, which is the only religious census that the British government has conducted. And that's an interesting resource because it indicates that as of 1852, there were an estimated 32,000 Latter-day Saints throughout the British Isles. To put that into context, that's more than twice as many Latter-day Saints as there are in North America and Canada combined. So there has been this sense that were it not for immigration, this very easily could have become a British church. But that supposition depends on a couple of premises. One is that British Latter-day Saints would endure in the faith, and that they would then perpetuate that faith to the rising generation. And that's been an enduring struggle. An enduring theme, I think, in British church history is perpetuating the church. So church membership grows in one of two ways. I mean, it grows naturally through families or it grows through converts. And I think what I failed to recognize at the outset of my research was how small the church had become in the early 20th century, and the effect of 2 world wars upon that membership. To the point that by the end of the Second World War, there's only an estimated 4,000 members of the church throughout the UK. Contrast that with the 32,000 in 1852. Now, it might be an overgeneralization to suppose that the bulk of British Latter-day Saints emigrated. I can't put my finger on the numbers here, but I do have a sense that it's not quite as large as we would suppose. My work with the English Northwest leads me to believe that you've got a couple of categories of members. Those who emigrate would be maybe a third of those that I'm seeing on the membership registers. Now, my math is horrible and really squishy, so don't quote me on that. But this is a church that comes back from the brink. And the real story, I think, of British church history is the post-war revival. The Beaumonts that are in this meeting today could tell you all about the post-war revival of the church in the 1960s. That's when things really take off. Now, that's a very rambling response to your question. I'm sorry if that diluted the significance of your question.
Big question here. Where does your name come from? What's your emigration ancestry, I think?
Well, I will tell you this. I had supposed Rasmussen is a Danish name, and I had supposed that when I served my mission in England, because England is so much closer to Denmark than is the United States, that most British people would be comfortable and confident in pronouncing my name. Not true. Over the course of 2 years of missionary service, I was called Elder Raspberry, Elder Rasputin, Elder Rasmonkey, every derivative you can think of that started with the letters R-A-S, so be it. So yeah, I am of Danish extraction, but my middle name is Lyman. And for those of you that are close followers of church history, I'm of the Amasa and Francis Lyman clan. So Amasa Lyman was an early member of the 12. His son Francis was president of the Quorum of the 12 in the early 20th century, and I'm descended from that group. So I claim ancestry from both the UK and Scandinavia. It's a rich heritage.
Okay. All right, a question from Grant Vaughan. It says, regarding the end of plural marriage in 1890, and then Utah statehood 1896, based in part on the necessity of abandoning ideals of a theocratic LDS homeland in the US. Any comments on that?
Yeah, what a mess.
Okay.
I mean, it's that is a challenging and pivotal episode, the effects of which we still deal with today. So there's no doubt that when Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and their associates are thinking in terms of Zion, they are thinking independently. They're thinking theocratically. I guess theo-democratically might be a more accurate term. So this is a phase in American history where the integrity of our constitutional government, the integrity of rule of law, is still maturing, especially along the American frontier. So what I think we see in the early history of Latter-day Saints is kind of an effort of bringing order to chaos, the chaos of the frontier. And of course, all of the proceedings that attended the persecution of the saints in Missouri, the prophet's martyrdom in Illinois, the saints feel this is a country that has forsaken them, that it hasn't been true to its own constitutional principles. Their failure to recognize and respect the practice of plural marriage as a tenet of religious belief, and of course the US Constitution ardently defends religious freedom, they just saw as unconscionable. So when those circumstances collide, withdrawal becomes almost inevitable. If the country won't tolerate us, we will form our own. We will form our own nation. Maybe Zion is kind of the city-state, but Deseret becomes the nation. And the saints maintain that hope until various incursions. You know, you've got Salt Lake City is often described as the crossroads of the West, and it really is, especially after gold is discovered at Sutter's Mill in 1849. Salt Lake City becomes this crossroads of commerce for the flow of westward migration. They're passing straight through the region that Brigham Young had hoped would be this independent and isolated nation. So plural marriage would be part of that challenge of how do American Latter-day Saints reconcile that religious belief with a constitution that refuses to protect it. And I think that addressing that authoritatively is going to be above my pay grade, but it's a compelling question.
Could I just pause Matthew for a minute and just ask Andrew, if you wouldn't mind just commenting along that vein there, from the community of Christ perspective, when we talk about gathering, at what point, did the community of Christ encourage or discourage gathering? So Matthew's kind of shown how the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints were going up to this point. I'm unfamiliar with the community of Christ's stance on that.
So I only have some small stories. There's a Peter Judd online, and I'll invite him to unmute and say something, because Peter gathered, in a sense, by going to Graceland College. So, and then he stayed in the United States. He still boasts having a British passport. So I think after World War II, for instance, there was an encouragement of young people in the British Isles to go to Graceland, and people stayed. Peter, I think, went to the States in the 1960s, and he stayed. And the person who started the Leicester congregation was a 21-year-old who started preaching on the market here in Leicester in 1885. He preached for 3 years before the first baptism happened. So a 21-year-old became a 24-year-old, very persistent. But then I think around 1918, he may have migrated to independence. So it's not as tidy as the story that Matthew has told. And we need to do a lot more work. I don't know if Peter has any comments. Peter Judd has any comments.
Well, thank you, Andrew. I'll just add that the discouraging of gathering, as it's been known in what was formerly RLDS, was kind of gathering to the center place, not just the USA and the Jackson County, Missouri, or Independence. And that kind of dwindled and stopped, I don't know, after World War II, the 50s and the 60s, although some people were still doing that. But I don't know really whether that was concurrent with the dwindling of migration from the UK to the center of the USA. Perhaps about the same time, but yes, that would be an interesting study, as would the study of migration of RLDS people from the beginning of the RLDS in the 1860s, from then on, certainly into the 20th century. That would be an interesting study, but I don't know anybody that's done that.
Right. Oh, well, there's room for study for all of us there. Thank you, Peter and Andrew. Matthew, I haven't let you off the hook yet. Come back. Question. We're just wondering, this is from Margaret Parker, where the majority of the immigrants traveled from in terms of globally. I know lots of Scandinavian members emigrated. Were the greater number of immigrants from the British Isles?
Oh, yes, handily. I would think proportionately the number of immigrants from the UK outnumbers Scandinavia maybe 4 or 5 to 1. So the Scandinavian wave of immigration is kind of a secondary wave. It doesn't, see, religious freedom doesn't even open up in Scandinavia until 1850. And so the moment that it does, you do see the arrival of Latter-day Saint missionaries, but then it takes a while for their presence to mature and for the immigration program to get into Scandinavia. And so you won't see them having the same kind of pioneer experience that the British Latter-day Saints had, because their emigration begins when you have other advances of communication and travel. So my ancestry, as a case in point, converted in Denmark in the early 1870s, and rather than push a handcart to Zion across the plains, they rode the Union Pacific Railroad and had a very different experience. So it is a second wave of the migratory history of the saints from Europe. Less significant in terms of numbers, but I think significant culturally in its own right.
Thank you. Thank you. From Mike and Jan, did the first presidency worry about the end of migration? Because in a sense, the church was split, some in the US, some in UK. And then, of course, communication was a lot more difficult than it is now. Would it split the church, saying that's the end of emigration?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. I don't know that I've considered that before. I think when you look at the timing of it, if emigration is, as near as I can discern, is conclusively ended by 1911, I think there is enough means of communicating to keep the thing intact. I think that the disruption caused by the First and Second World War was more disruptive to the unity of the church transatlantically than was bringing emigration to an end. But developments in communication are such that they can keep this intact. But it's an astute question, because when you look at the original Church of Christ and the seeds of the great apostasy, what you have is rapid growth without central control, and the thing begins to collapse upon itself. So communication is vital, and it does make sense to me that would have been part of the rationale for gathering the converts into one place, is to keep that unity intact. I mean, scripturally, when you look at the way Zion is defined in the Pearl of Great Price, it's characterized by unity, one heart, one mind, no poor among them, and they dwell in righteousness. How do you do that when you have members scattered in all places of the globe? You may be familiar with the story of what happened to the church in Hawaii when it withdrew its missionaries in the 1860s, and Walter Gibson, who had left the church, styled himself as a prophet, went to Hawaii and kind of rerouted their devotion towards him. The inability to keep in touch with the saints in Hawaii presented major problems for the church in the second half of the 19th century. So it's a great question. I'm kind of dancing around it a little bit, but I think that's the best I can do.
Thank you. Just a note of thanks, Margaret saying, thank you. Your presentation has been very informative and interesting. Thanks for all who organized it and made it available.
Thank you,
now,
Margaret.
Here's one other question. We've got just another 7 minutes or so of questions and answers, so we've still got room for a few more. Did World War I cause a revival of interest in migration from British saints? I guess, you've just had the horrors of war. Did that suddenly make them think, oh, let's go to the New World?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And in the years that immediately precede the First World War, and I deal with this in my book, that there is a very interesting second wave of revival of interest in the church, and numbers of convert baptisms increase in the first decade of the 20th century. What those increased conversions do, is it puts the church into the public eye, which it really hadn't been since the 1860s and 70s. The emigration saps the church so profoundly that the church is just kind of eking along. You have this uptick of conversions in the early 20th century, and there's this cultural backlash against it. And all of the old stories about the Mormons, about the missionaries, about immigration, they cast this pall of suspicion over the immigration movement. So there is this anti-Mormon crusade in the first decade of the 20th century that I think had some members of the church running scared. Now, you'll remember from my presentation that one of the few remaining justifications for emigrating, even after the policies had changed, was to get away from the persecution and reproach that came with belonging to a very unpopular faith. So the threat of war, I think, in one way, the threat of war was a welcome change of subject, because the church and church members were getting a lot of heat. And then once war breaks out, it totally changes the public's attention. Latter-day Saints become this very minor issue when you've got war on your hands. So I don't think that wartime motivates emigration. At least I haven't seen any evidence of that. But the anti-Mormon crusade that preceded the First World War, I think might have spurred a little more immigration, getting away from those that disdain you.
Excellent. Well, the one question that's on all of our lips, let me just tell you a story of somebody in my ward. Her name's Pat Madison. I know the Holmes will know her. When she's from Liverpool, raised in Liverpool, and her mother, and I think it was her grandmother as well, as kind of behavior modification, used to threaten her. You behave yourself or I'll get the Mormons to take you in their tunnel, which runs from Liverpool right through to Utah. So my question is, if in all your research, have you ever found that tunnel? I'm No?
Well, you know, a branch of that tunnel actually goes to my house, Peter, so I've got ready access. Oh. And, you know, what's funny is that extending that it's a wonderful bit of urban legend. I mean, it's just absolutely delightful. And when I was a missionary in Liverpool in 1996, I was surprised how that thing has persisted, that there was an assumption on the part of some that that tunnel started at the Stake Center on Millbank in Liverpool, and that is precisely why the Great Salt Lake is salty, is because it's filled with Atlantic Ocean water, and the tunnel was the conduit for that. So lots of fun there.
A question from Roger Hullhead. He says, if you had time, what area of research do you still wish to pursue?
I'm going to write Roger Hullhead's biography.
There we go.
No, I'll tell you what I would like to do. It's an interesting question, and I wish that I had more time to devote to this. As I look at 19th century British church history, and as I look at church historical issues that present challenges to contemporary members, I've been surprised to discover that a lot of these issues can be traced to one calendar year, and that's the year 1852. In 1852, the policy of priesthood and temple restriction levied against members of the church of African descent is formalized. In 1852, the church also publicly announces its practice of plural marriage. It's a year filled with political and social tension in America. And the Latter-day Saints don't live in a vacuum, despite what they had hoped to achieve in withdrawing from the country. So there are some very sensitive and interesting and nuanced church history issues that kind of converge in the year 1852. So if I had time and resources, I would want to put that year under the microscope and just try and contextualize these things, because many contemporary members of the church continue to have issues or questions or concerns about the church's racial history, the history of plural marriage, and 1852 seems to be a moment where all of these items come together. I think that an examination of that calendar year, and there's plenty of source material to draw from, might help contextualize these issues in a way that could help settle some of the frayed nerves that persist in the church to this day.
Excellent. One final note of thank yous just popped up. Thank you from Justice Manning for a very interesting, thoroughly researched, enthusiastically presented lecture, very informative. Thanks also to the organizers. And that's a nice way to wrap things up, I think. We've come to the hour to kind of say farewell to one and all. We'd like to thank Matthew for his time and your dedication over the years for producing that research. And I hope you get to do your wish on 1852. I'd love to see that. Thanks for your questions. This is the third webinar we've done. We'd encourage you, if you haven't watched the other two, go back and watch those as well. I would say we'd love your feedback for this webinar. What do we do well? What could be improved? And do send it to Andrew and myself. And our emails will go in the chat function there as well. Now, we do have our next webinar. We're only doing one more this year. Usually we do it at the end of every month, but the end of next month is American Thanksgiving, and quite a few of our people that have followed us over the last little while will be celebrating that. So don't want to interfere with that. So we are just doing one on December the 10th. It will be kind of a Christmas themed one. Myself and Andrew and possibly somebody else will be presenting some things about the importance of Christmas Day in the early saints. We'll be looking at the very first British Mission Conference held in the cockpit. A little touch of Denmark will be in there, and also the Community of Christ Christmas Day celebration as well. So we'll be bringing all those little Christmas aspects together, and we'll email more information out to you as well. So thank you one and all. We hope you'll be able to join us. We've recorded that session. We'll send a link out to everybody that has registered with us, and we thank you for joining us. Goodbye one and all, and thank you again to Matthew.